I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good afternoon and welcome to the Briefing PM and all of the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Darren McCaffrey and here's what's coming up. Over the next hour between 3 and 4 PM, the Prime Minister has told ministers that they must get a grip on the cost of living crisis. We'll be covering that with a Conservative MP. What should the Prime Minister be doing next? Also, the Russian Foreign Minister has warned that the threat of a nuclear war between Russia and the West is now higher than it ever was during the Cold War. We'll be speaking to a military expert about the potential for the escalation of the Ukraine conflict. And Elon Musk's Twitter takeover. Is it the saviour of the platform or a dangerous new age of potential online disinformation? What changes will it make? Do you care? Get in touch about that and so much more on the programme. You can email me at gbviews@gbviews.uk or tweet me at GBNews. All that and much more between now and 4 PM. But first, at the top of the hour, here's Rosie Wright with the news.
Good afternoon, it's just gone 3 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. Russia is accusing NATO of waging a proxy war with Moscow by arming Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, says weapons sent to Kyiv by the West are legitimate targets. But the Armed Forces Minister here in the UK, James Heapy, says individual countries are supplying military aid, not NATO.
NATO is reinforcing the alliance's eastern flank as a defensive measure to reassure our Eastern European allies. NATO is not the donor community. Many of the people in the donor community are NATO countries, but similarly, the Australians, the Kiwis and others are part of it as well.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has also dismissed Ukraine's proposal to hold peace talks in Mariupol, saying it's too early to talk about mediation. Those comments come after a meeting with the UN Secretary-General in Moscow. Antonio Guterres says a ceasefire in Ukraine should be created as soon as possible.
I have proposed the establishment of a humanitarian contact group, bringing together the Russian Federation, Ukraine and the United Nations to look for opportunities for the opening of safe corridors with local cessation of hostilities and to guarantee that they are actually effective.
In other news now, former Radio 1 DJ Tim Westwood has strongly denied allegations of sexual misconduct. It's after 3 women accused him of predatory behaviour in a joint Guardian and BBC investigation. 4 others said they were groped by him between 1992 and 2017. He's alleged by the parties to have misused his position to take advantage of the women who were in their early teens and early 20s. Police searches are ongoing in rural Lancashire for a missing woman believed to have been kidnapped. 33-year-old Katie Kenyon from Burnley hasn't been seen since last Friday morning. Lancashire police have been given more time to question a 50-year-old man who has been arrested on suspicion of kidnap. The police have issued a photograph of a white transit van which Miss Kenyon is believed to have travelled in with a man, and they've urged anyone with information to come forward. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has hit out at how his deputy's been treated after an article about her was published in the Mail on Sunday. An anonymous Conservative MP was quoted in the article as saying that Angela Rayner had used her legs to distract Boris Johnson during Prime Minister's questions. The Speaker of the House of Commons, who's meeting the editor of the Mail on Sunday, described it as misogynistic and offensive. Sir Keir Starmer says a culture change is needed in politics.
She's a formidable politician, a brilliant politician, and this is just disgusting, rank sexism, rank misogyny. And it's not just Angela that faces this, lots of women in politics too, and that's why obviously we need to call out anybody involved in this, but we need a culture change as well.
The Prime Minister is going to chair a committee to tackle the cost of living crisis in the coming weeks. Downing Street says a number of ideas were discussed during a cabinet meeting this morning, which will feed into a more formal process. Boris Johnson has hinted that parents could receive more childcare support, and he wants ministers to come up with ways to ease financial pressures on households without, though, relying on new government spending. Meanwhile, the cost of food is rising at its fastest rate in 11 years, with the average household now spending an extra £271 this year. Data from Qatar shows grocery price inflation hit 5.9% in April. That's the fastest rise since the end of 2011. The number of items also on promotion has decreased. Bars and clubs that have a bad track record on spiking must improve if they're going to have their licences renewed. It's according to a new report by MPs which says it's difficult to know the true scale of drink spiking because of victim blaming and a lack of support. Safeguarding Minister Rachel Maclean is urging victims of spiking to come forward.
We are issuing guidance across the board to A&E departments and also to GPs and all those primary care settings. If you're worried about something that's happened to you or a friend, please go forward and get help. And we're working really hard to make sure that all the healthcare professionals and policing colleagues know what they should do if a victim comes forward.
The number of children in the UK with hepatitis has risen to 114, according to the World Health Organization. 10 have needed a liver transplant. The UK Health Security Agency say most of the cases of liver inflammation are in children under 5. Experts are still trying to understand the cause of the spike in hepatitis. Downing Street say there are no plans to make the extra bank holiday this year for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee permanent. The Confederation of British Industry and the Archbishop of Canterbury are calling for the day off on the 3rd of June to become an annual event. Number 10, though, says a bank holiday will cost the economy £2 billion. This is GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now, back to Darren for the briefing.
I have to say, it's a bit of a shame the government aren't going to make that bank holiday permanent. Many might suggest we need a union day in the UK, a bit like they've got Independence Day in the United States or Bastille Day in France. Why don't we have a bank holiday to celebrate the union? Give people an extra day off. Do get in touch about that or anything else on the programme today. We're online, on TV and on your DAB digital radio. It is 7 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Tuesday afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for your company. We're going to start, though, talking about polls, because in just over a week's time, voters will head to the voting polls across the UK. Local elections will be the first real test of public opinion on Boris Johnson and his premiership, not least of all, of course, on those COVID fine that he's received. It's given Labour, the scandal has, the longest sustained poll lead since 2017. But will it make that much difference? Let's speak to the head of political polling at Opinion, Chris Curtis, who joins us now. Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on GB News. Let's just talk about the general overall polls, because it is fair to say that Labour essentially this year have built up a pretty substantial lead over the Conservatives and managed to maintain it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, we've seen consistently in the polls, really since the start of the year, really till before Christmas, the Labour Party has been ahead. But not just that. When you look below those headline numbers, you see pretty bad approval ratings for the Prime Minister, minus 25 in our most recent polls. Around twice as many people think he's doing a bad job as think he's doing a good job. People particularly tell us that they don't trust him to tell the truth anymore, which kind of isn't the sort of thing you want if you're running a country. But also on top of that as well, particularly given the ongoing cost of living situation, the Conservatives are no longer particularly trusted to run the economy. Most of the time, the Tories win elections because people think, well, they're not the nicest bunch in the world, but I trust them to run the economy well and keep things going. Increasingly, the public no longer think that that's true.
And it's a whole range of issues, isn't it, Chris? Not just the economy, but immigration, things like the National Health Service, where the Conservatives are effectively behind Labour across the board.
Yeah, it's actually really hard to find an issue at the moment in which the Conservatives are leading Labour. I mean, one of the places where people do currently think the Prime Minister's doing a good job is in response to the Ukraine crisis, which is why Boris Johnson mentions it quite a lot. But pretty much apart from that, the public thinks that the current government's doing a bad job at everything else.
Let's talk about Labour, though, because even though they're ahead in the polls, I think it's fair to say it's not as if the public have been won over by Keir Starmer in the sense that it's the government faltering rather than the opposition surging. What are the public's views on the leader of the opposition?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good summation. I mean, what you're noticing, pretty much whatever question you ask, is the Conservative number going down and the Labour number going up a little bit, but nowhere near as much as the Conservative number has gone down. And so, for example, if you ask who do you think would make the best Prime Minister, Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer, the answer that you're most likely to get is neither at the moment. And that's what we're noticing in our most recent polls. When it comes to Keir Starmer specifically, there is a view among the public that he's competent. He's sort of managed to get that message across quite important, and competence is, an important skill in politics. But there's also questions that people have about whether he's strong enough to take on the top job or whether he's a bit of a weak leader. And I think that's the thing that he's got to convince the public that he is strong enough if he wants to win the next election.
So let's look ahead, though, to these elections next week, at local elections. Now, it's quite difficult to measure these things because, of course, not all councils are up and certain sections of councils are only up and they're defending seats that were fought 4 years ago. But is there a kind of border or a line that we can draw in terms of maybe the overall percentage share of the vote where the political parties will be looking out for how well they've done?
Yeah, I mean, people tend to judge local elections based on the numbers of seats gained or the numbers of seats lost. And I tend to think that's a pretty bad way to measure overall success. And I think that's particularly true this time round. Because while the Labour Party has made quite substantial gains since the last general election in 2019, when Boris Johnson won that landslide, they're not up very much compared to where they were in 2018, which was the last time these seats were fought, which means that sort of gains and loss number after Thursday may not look particularly bad for the Conservatives. But all it really means is the Conservatives are back in the position in 2018, which was pretty difficult for them in the first place. The other thing to bear in mind this year is that 40% of the seats that are up are in London. And while Labour's been making pretty substantial gains in, say, Wales or in parts of the northeast, also parts of the northwest, their swing towards them in London has been much smaller. So I think actually, despite all of the points that I was just making about the polls overall being bad for the Conservatives, maybe next week's results aren't going to look particularly bad.
And just very finally, Chris, is there anywhere that you, others, that we should be kind of looking out for as a kind of a test beds for that overall national moods?
Well, the one place you shouldn't be looking at is Wandsworth and Westminster, and I fear always that people look at those two seats. People in politics need to get outside the Wandsworth and Westminster bubble when it comes to this set of local elections, because they're very uninteresting seats and they're not representative of the rest of the country. I'd be looking at a lot of places with traditional swing seats, or particularly in those red wall seats. Bury, that would be a particularly interesting place to look at. Labour have been doing all right there. They still hold the council, I think, but can they start to make some more gains back off the Conservatives? Because they'll need to if they want to win those two marginal seats they're back at the next general election.
Fascinating yourself, as always. Chris, thank you very much indeed. Chris Curtis there joining us.
Thanks, Darren.
From central London, and we'll have full coverage, of course, of the local elections here on GB News. In fact, our coverage will begin next Wednesday when I'll be up in Sunderland trying to get the mood of people, as Chris was saying, outside of the Westminster and Wandsworth bubble. Let's move on now to talk about Ukraine, though, because Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has warned that there is now real danger of a third world war breaking out after a day of apparent Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil. In an interview with Russian news agencies, he criticised Kyiv's approach to peace talks, adding, "Goodwill has its limits, but if it isn't reciprocal, that doesn't help the negotiation process." His comments came after a rocket-propelled grenade attack on a government building in a pro-Russian breakaway region of Moldova sparked fears of Russia's war spreading further into Europe. Well, let's reflect on some of this now. Joining me is Major General Chip Chapman. Chip, as always, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's just start, first of all, with these kind of two separate attacks in the last 24 hours or so. One just inside Russia in an oil depot that looks like it may well have come from the Ukrainian side. And then this explosions, or several explosions, in Moldova.
Yeah, well, you have to look at this in terms of what is a theatre of war and how you construct that theatre when you're campaigning. So from a Russian perspective, you have the close battle, that is what is going on in Donetsk and Luhansk. And you have the deep battle, that is the area towards the border of NATO and further potentially, to stop and degrade the Ukrainian forces bringing things to bear. And if the Russians have that in Ukraine, then the Ukrainians can have that in Russia. There is nothing to stop the Ukrainians pursuing a deep battle. And of course, that's why they're going after oil supplies, to try and break the link between oil and highly mechanized and tank forces. That is absolutely sensible to do that. Now, Lavrov, I think, is just using rhetoric, which is one of the things you can also escalate to try and prevent NATO from delivering supplies. But I don't think we're going to do that, because just as it is a strategic objective of Russia, or two strategic objectives, to divide and weaken NATO and to divide and deter the EU, so it is the case that we also, I would suspect now, want to weaken Russia.
Do you think those attacks on the train stations then were an attempt to disrupt the supply of weapons from the West into Ukraine? And in essence, I mean, that's the point kind of Lavrov was making today, wasn't he? That, you know, the West is drawing itself into this war because it's effectively arming the Ukrainians so much.
No, that's absolutely his point. So rail junctions, which we saw at least 2 weeks ago with the attack on Kramatorsk to begin with, where 50 civilians were hit, that is bad targeting, is absolutely to prevent that potential of the combat power being brought to bear. But it is wider on a Russian sense. I think what they're doing is almost like the air campaign from the Casablanca conference prior to the last year of the Second World War, which is the progressive destruction and dislocation of the military, industrial and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the Ukrainians, to try and cease them from supporting and to break their will. And it is valid that in the next 2 weeks, we have Victory Day coming up in 13 days' time. That is also a dangerous time when they can escalate. And of course, you can escalate by weapons as well. There's only two more that they could potentially use. That's chemical weapons or nuclear weapons.
Do you think it's helpful, and maybe this is more of a political question, Chip, than a military one, for, you know, the US Defense Secretary, I think it was yesterday, to say that, you know, one of the strategic missions now really of the United States seems to be to kind of degrade Russia to the point where it could never do something like this again. I mean, that does risk escalation, doesn't it?
Not necessarily. I don't think the Russians really want to take on NATO, and then you have to go above the things I said about the strategic aims to the grand strategic aims of Russia. It's been quite clear for a number of years that the grand strategic aims of Russia include, and this was sort of mentioned by Lavrov really, that they want to regain territory in their lost spheres of influence. Spheres of influence is a Cold War construct which no one really buys into anymore, apart from Russia. That's why all the former Soviet satellites joined the NATO. They feared a revanchist Russia, which is why they did what they did. They also want to re-establish themselves as a great power, and Putin has probably done more damage to Russia than Nicholas II in the revolution in 1917 in the time in the last 61 days.
Yeah, well, it's quite claim, but we did hear, didn't we, from Ben Wallace yesterday, suggesting up to 15,000 Russian soldiers may well have lost their lives. Just finally, Chip, on what's happening in the Donbass region, we know there's quite intense fighting, don't we? We know the weather's been pretty awful there for the last couple of days. Do we have any real sense whether Russia is making any substantial progress, enough progress, as you say, that Vladimir Putin could claim some type of victory, in just a couple of weeks' time on the 9th of May?
Well, to really make progress, you need shock, surprise, control of the air to try and gain operational manoeuvre to absolutely unhinge the Ukrainians by either envelopment or encirclement. They have to do that quickly. I don't think they will. I think we'll be back to the future in what we call entropy. That is, after the initial shock or surprise degrade, then attrition then predominates once again. We're probably into a longer war scenario.
Chip, as always, really appreciate your analysis here on GB News. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, that Major General Chip Chapman there, joining us from Salisbury. Thank you. Do get in touch, by the way, gbviews@gbnews.uk. I want to hear what you've got to make about all those stories. We're going to talk about Poland in just a couple of minutes' time, also about the cost of living crisis as well, and Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. What's it going to mean for the social media platform? But before all of that, let's bring you up to date with the weather this afternoon, and feels like it hasn't rained in weeks. Here's the Met Office.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McKibben from the Met Office. Quite a bit of cloud out there at the moment, and much of that will thin and break overnight, allowing clear spells and, in places, a touch of frost by the morning. The reason being high pressure to the north of the UK, and around that high pressure, with the winds going in a clockwise fashion, we're pulling colder air in from the northeast. That's certainly having a notable impact on the east coast this afternoon, with temperatures at 9 to 12 Celsius and a bit of a chilly breeze. A lot of cloud across Scotland, northern and eastern England to begin things, but that tends to disappear overnight, and with lengthy clear spells, still some cloud floating around, but virtually everyone dry, and with those clear spells, well, temperatures will fall away. Mid to high single figures in most places, but in some sheltered spots just below freezing, particularly for parts of Scotland and northern England. So a touch of frost around first thing Wednesday morning, but plenty of sunshine to start things off. And actually, it's looking like a sunnier day for Scotland, for northern and eastern England. Still some cloud here and there, but on the whole, a dry day, a fine day, and with lighter winds, with that sunshine, although temperatures technically will be a degree or two lower than Tuesday, it will feel, I think, a bit more pleasant. Cloud again comes and goes on Wednesday night, but enough clear skies out there to allow a fairly widespread frost, certainly across northern England, for parts of Scotland where we've got those clear skies. Further south, frost a bit more limited. It will be in sheltered spots where we've got the most prolonged clear spells, where we'll see those temperatures dip close to, if not a touch below freezing. So another chilly start to Thursday, but quite quickly it does warm up. And actually we'll have lost that cool easterly breeze in the east coast, so it will warm up here especially. And for the vast majority, Thursday's a dry and bright day. Friday, a bit more cloud around. Saturday, fine.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you, or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Very welcome back to GB News. It is just about 25 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Tuesday afternoon. We're going to stick with Ukraine and the war there, because Poland has been one of the loudest voices demanding that all EU countries immediately stop buying Russian oil, gas and coal in response to Moscow's invasion, putting itself forward as an example for others to follow. This, despite, of course, the phrase rhetoric, Poland is also having a hard time abandoning Russian energy itself. It was one of the first EU countries to promise to ban all imports of Russian fossil fuels. However, going cold turkey on oil and gas is proving to be a bit more difficult. Joining me in the studio is the Polish journalist George Basinski. Thank you very much indeed, George, for joining us. Just first of all, clearly Poland has been one of the more critical voices for a very long time about Russia. But it, like lots of other places in Europe, it's still reliant on its oil and gas.
Of course, many countries in Europe still rely and will rely to some extent. It was never about fully banning any imports from Russia. I said it many times, that's okay to trade, but be sure that the percentage of the trade is so trivial that any moment there is a serious problem with Russia, you may be able to find other sources of gas, of oil, of coal. Unfortunately, many countries, especially in Western Europe, they did not listen. They are now very submissive almost in terms of being reliant on Russian energy. And that's because they're so slow and even reluctant sometimes to impose the strongest sanctions possible on Russia.
But at the same time, you know, Olaf Scholz, I'm sure the Austrian Chancellor would say the same thing, as in if they were to turn off the taps immediately, entire industries would have to shut down. People would lose their jobs. Countries would go into recession.
It doesn't have to happen today. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but it has to happen as soon as possible, because there are tens of billions going into the pockets of Putin right now, who's then using this money to invade an innocent country. So Poland, I think, is a very good role model, because there's a clear roadmap about what the country is doing. It opened the liquefied gas terminal just a few years ago, and it imports gas from Qatar, from the United States, from other countries. The Baltic pipe is almost finished. That's almost 900 kilometers from Norway to Denmark to Poland. There is a clear vision, and Germany does not have a vision at the moment. They have a very serious wake-up call, because for decades they just wanted to be reliant on Russia and become that sort of energy hub and a junior partner of Russia in Germany. It's a total failure, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Fascinating, isn't it, how much history, I think, kind of plays into the two national psyches, if you like, in the sense that Poland is very much a country that's been quite vocal in its criticism of Russia in recent years, really since the collapse of the Soviet Union to a large degree, and obviously before that as well. But in Germany, there's almost been looking back on history and almost been apologetic towards Russia, given what happened during the Second World War. Does that explain these two neighbouring countries, two very different approaches to the Russian bear?
Yes, of course it does. I don't want to be unfair towards our German friends. I wouldn't want to go back to all those Ribbentrop-Molotov deals that they did during the Second World War. We should look at today and at the future. But unfortunately, yes, if you didn't have Russian Soviet tanks all around your country and the Soviets killing and raping, you don't fully understand the threat. Poland had that, and it's not so easy to to become energy independent, because you have so many of these unfavorable deals from the communist times or signed by the post-communists. It takes a lot of time. Yet these countries like the Baltic states and Poland are courageous enough to do these moves. And I strongly hope that Germany will follow suit.
How does this fit into the EU's plan? Because as far as I understood, the EU had essentially said that they are going to massively cut down in the months and years to come on Russian oil and gas.
Yes, that's true, and I think it's a very good signal. It's slow, but it's a good signal from Brussels. Brussels often played that sort of good and bad game, where sometimes they supported certain projects. So, for example, they put some money into the Baltic pipe that works for the energy independence, but at the same time is fining Poland for some ridiculous things. Like recently, I read that the EU deducted, I think, 30 million euro from some of the payments that were supposed to go to Poland under a regional development educational fund, because there was some discussion about a coal mine. And yes, we should be going away from coal. Yes, we should be heading towards renewables, because renewables also mean independence. But we shouldn't have this green mad agenda where you're killing off industries just to replace it with something else. It needs to be taken step by step. And I think nuclear is also a word we should not be afraid of and should look at in Europe. And before, it was Brussels that slowed down certain nuclear projects.
Well, indeed, and of course, the Germans abandoned their plans, didn't they, after the Fukushima disaster? Just very finally, George, just when we talk about refugees briefly, Poland's taken an awful lot, millions of Ukrainian refugees. Is there a sense that it's now reached capacity, that because we heard from the mayor of Warsaw essentially saying there was no room left. Where is kind of the capacity of Poland to take more refugees?
Well, some people said it's over 1.5 million of refugees would be impossible and would be difficult. Now it's very helpful that some other European countries and also the UK are taking in some of the refugees. Poland cannot take in so many. It can work for a short period of time, but at how many years we're looking. So I strongly hope that with this Ukrainian bravery and some minor successes at the front, actually, they will be able to push back or hold down the Russian invasion, and then many of the Ukrainians will be able to come back. And I spent almost a month at the border, and, you know, I speak to people, and some of the refugees crying, they said they don't want to go to Germany, they don't want to go to France, the UK, elsewhere, just want to stay for a few weeks, hopefully, and then come back to a peaceful Ukraine. And, you know, we can just pray for that.
Well, we can, but I suspect it's going to be, unfortunately, longer than a few weeks. But really appreciate your analysis, George. Thank you very much indeed. George,
thank you so much.
Joining us in the studio. OK, we're going to pause there on the briefing. Coming up in just a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about the cost of living crisis here at home. We're going to be speaking to a Conservative MP and also talking about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter. That and much more between now and 4. But first, just after 3:30, here's the news again with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's 3:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date. Former Radio 1 DJ Tim Westwood has strongly denied allegations of sexual misconduct. In a Guardian and BBC investigation, 3 women accused him of predatory behaviour and 4 others said they were groped by him between 1992 and 2017. He's alleged to have misused his position to take advantage of the women, who are all in their teens and their early 20s. Police searches are ongoing in rural Lancashire to try and find a missing woman believed to have been kidnapped. 33-year-old Katie Kenyon from Burnley hasn't been seen since last Friday morning. Lancashire police have been given more time to question a 50-year-old man arrested on suspicion of kidnap. The Prime Minister will chair a committee to tackle the cost of living crisis in the coming weeks. Downing Street says a number of ideas were discussed during a cabinet meeting this morning. Boris Johnson, who's hinted that parents could receive more childcare support, wants ministers to come up with ways to ease financial pressures on households without, though, relying on new government spending. Hundreds of people lined the streets for the funeral of Harry Billinge, the D-Day veteran who raised thousands of pounds to build a national memorial for his fallen comrades. Mr. Billing was 18 when he landed in Normandy in 1944. He died earlier this month, aged 96. You're up to date now on GB News. We'll keep you up to date across the afternoon. Shortly, we'll be back to Darren with the briefing.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very welcome back to GB News. It is 24 minutes to 4 o'clock. We're on TV, online and on your DAB digital radios. Thank you for your company on this Tuesday afternoon. Do get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.uk, and we'll get to some of those later on in the programme. But first, let's talk about the cost of living crisis, because the Prime Minister has told Cabinet this morning that it's time to get a grip with the cost of living crisis. The government's under, of course, intense pressure to ease the burden on working people and families across the country, as many struggle to pay their bills due to the surge in inflation and rising energy prices. Well, join me now is the Conservative MP for Workington, Mark Jenkinson. Mark, as always, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on GB News. I mean, frankly, in the end, it shouldn't involve a cabinet meeting or a working group to come up with the solution to the cost of living crisis, and that, frankly, is the government having to chuck some money at it.
Yeah, I mean, without doubt, there are things that we're going to have to do, and we mustn't be under any illusion that those interventions that we can do are expensive and come at significant cost, predominantly for taxpayers.
Come at cost for taxpayers, but the whole point is it wouldn't be better to kind of spread that out and try and help people at the moment, Mark, because there are people who are frankly struggling to put food on their table, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, inflation's pretty high. The energy cap's going to go up again in October. I mean, there is a sense out there that the government just at the moment at least aren't doing enough.
So, I would caution on October. We don't know what's going to happen in October, but we do. The current assumption is that, of course, it will have to rise again based on current electricity prices. And there's a huge amount of work ongoing in government to tackle future electricity and energy prices, of course, and insulating homes and various other things. But of course, in the short term, that's why Rishi's council tax rebate was targeted at those lower banded homes with a fund for vulnerable people who weren't eligible for that through the council tax. Those are the people that we need to target. But also, I just caution some of my colleagues in the House of Commons, not necessarily on my side, on all sides, who recommend, for example, scrapping. We hear talk of scrapping green levies on energy bills, but those levies are actually paying for schemes like the Warm Homes discount, boiler replacement schemes, insulation schemes. And those are things that we shouldn't, in the medium to long term, be thinking about scrapping at all. And in fact, in the short term, a mid-contract, and we wouldn't be able to.
In saying that, I mean, many, and including, it must be said, some of the energy bosses themselves have suggested that should be the case, that those green levies should be, if not scrapped, moved at least into general taxation. VAT could be cut immediately. I mean, there are things the government... I suppose my fundamental thread here, Mark, is that, people are struggling right now. The government's sitting around having to think about what it needs to do. It needs to be doing something now. Surely you recognise that, no?
Yeah, and I mean, the government is moving and has moved to deal with some of those issues. And of course, as we hear today, more to come, which is good news. But just on those green levies, there is an argument. I've made the argument for moving them into general taxation. I've made the argument on removing VAT from fuel bills, not necessarily to deal with the cost of living crisis, because at the end of the day, it's probably £90 at best on the average fuel bill annually. But just because we can, now that we've left the European Union, we can remove VAT. But we must be under no illusion that comes at a cost, and that has to be found somewhere. So I think the PM is right to ask the Cabinet to explore all avenues across every department, and some of those may be Brexit dividends for Jacob and removal of tariffs on foods and things that we can do now that we've left the European Union. But it's absolutely right that we continually review those things that we can do to ease the cost of living for my constituents, which is the biggest issue on the doorstep every single day that I am out at the moment.
I'm sure it is. One of the things the government, of course, could immediately do is try and bring down the cost of fuel. There's much talk about a new coal mine being opened in Cumbria. Welcome news?
Very welcome news. So I would just urge caution on reporting around that. It is a mine for coking coal, purely for coking coal for steel use. Not an ounce would go to electricity generation. Whatever we think, whether we think we should or shouldn't be burning coal, that mine will not produce coal for thermal power generation. But it is fantastic news if the reporting is correct. West Cumbria has been calling for this mine. I and other colleagues, including Trudy, whose constituency it's in, has been lobbying hard for initially for the county council to approve it, for the county council to ignore the environmental alarmists that tried to get it shut down because they don't fully understand what it's going to do, and again for the government not to bow to the pressure from those environmental alarmists. But unfortunately, such is the calling procedure that when international talk around it from the likes of John Kerry and others it caused significant issues around the comms around this mine. The calling procedure, the Secretary of State was left with no alternative but to call in this this application. Of course, it's been through a planning inquiry. I'm quite buoyed by what I heard and saw through the planning inquiry. I'm hopeful that the planning inspector's recommendation is to approve the mine, and that Michael Gove will just pass on that recommendation. Well,
we will wait and
opportunity.
We will wait and see on that. And Mark, just before I let you go, just one question about Angela Rayner. She's given an interview today to ITV saying that she feels crestfallen, of course, about the reporting in the Mail on Sunday, in which it was claimed that Conservative MPs had said that she tried to distract the Prime Minister by crossing and uncrossing her legs. Of course, the Prime Minister himself has called it sexist tripe. I mean, I think there is an attempt to try and find out who potentially, or whoever these people were, these Conservative MPs. You know your colleagues pretty well. I mean, is there a sense that these are a few bad apples, or is that a charge that many might say is more wider within the Conservative Party, more wider within Parliament? That sense of sexism.
It's certainly not. It's certainly not something that I've seen or heard from any of my colleagues on both sides of the House, and it's not something I would stand to listen to either. There is a suggestion. I mean, you suggest multiple, but I think the suggestion was one Conservative MP, and I would urge the Mail on Sunday to name that MP if they exist, and let's get this out into the open. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable for Angela. It's not acceptable for any of my female colleagues, and that we just in 2022 we shouldn't be having to. That's not what we should be having to deal with, or they shouldn't be having to deal with.
OK, Mark, as always, really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mark Dickinson there, joining us from his constituency. Now let's move on to talk about football, because the government has promised to back the main proposals from a fan-led review into English football. The report commissioned by the former Sports Minister Tracy Crouch highlighted 10 key recommendations. The Sports Minister, Nigel Huddleston, has said that the changes set out represent a real turning point for football and will have a considerable impact on clubs. Well, join me, delighted to say, is our sports broadcaster, Aidan McGee, in the studio. Aidan, thank you for joining us. Just talk us through kind of what is in this kind of fan-led review that the government looks like it's going to implement.
Well, there were 10 points. I mean, let's cut to the chase. The key thing, and that's the thing that will be getting people within football slightly worried and a bit, they'll be raising eyebrows on it, that's for sure, is the independent regulator, prospects of an independent body being able to veto certain things that football clubs do, or even organisations like the FA or the Premier League do. Now, my reservations would be that this is going to be hugely expensive. It's going to not come into force until 2024. It was mainly brought out about a year ago when the Super League was about to happen. Almost a year ago today, I was on the front line covering it at Stamford Bridge. Now, that died a death within 36 hours. So if it's been brought in as a response to that, well, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think that's going to happen again. Those top 6 clubs are never going to try any stunt like that again, because the backlash was absolutely fierce. And
it almost showed that the system that's in place at the moment kind of works anyway.
That's what I was thinking. I mean, I did not expect 2,000 or 3,000 Chelsea fans. Chelsea fans were deemed to be the ones who were on side with the new way football was run. Maybe they might be in favour of a new Super League, yet they were out there with their boots on, with their placards and everything else, saying we want our Tuesday nights in Stoke, not instead of going to Barcelona on a Saturday. And they made their presence felt all around the country. So now, don't get me wrong, the current system of government is not really, or governance isn't really fit for purpose. So a big problem for me would be the redistribution of TV money. So you're seeing a situation now within the league where just by finishing bottom, position 20 in the Premier League, you can walk away with £140 million in prize money and solidarity payments for not even getting a point. Then you go down into the Championship, you're relegated. Surprise, surprise, your economic power means that you're able to spend your way back up. These clubs, Fulham, Bournemouth, Watford, Norwich, West Brom, are just yo-yoing at the moment. Fulham and Norwich haven't even played each other in the last 4 years because they keep missing each other, because they're going up and down. So it's creating what Arsene Wenger called many years ago financial doping. So my solution would be, give them the parachute money. It's a big adjustment in terms of a loss of revenue when a team gets relegated. So they need something to cushion the blow. But don't give it all within 2 or 3 years. Spread it out over maybe 6. Give them incentives for investing in their training ground or something like that, or something in the community, a women's team or something. So that would be my reservation about it.
And this is a real slap in the face, isn't it, really, to the FA? Saying that...
Well, not necessarily. No, not necessarily, because Tracy Crouch has said in her report that they might actually be the regulator in time to come. It's going to be based at St George's Park. I mean, some people would view that with extreme suspicion. I don't really think it can work if the FA are doing it and marking their own homework. They're already petrified of the Premier League. They're not going to suddenly go around regulating them. It's not that easy. Further to that, I just think maybe that the FA, if they were held to account a bit more pointedly over certain things, like the things we've discussed just then, like the owners and directors test as well. I mean, there's no evidence that a new owners and directors test would be any more effective than the ones that currently exist. You get shysters coming in, buying clubs, leveraging debt against them and placing them into all kinds of economic strife. So there are ways of improving that without creating a regulator. And we also look at the history of regulators in other areas of public life. Ofgem was set up in 22 years ago. To regulate our energy sector, I don't think it's done a particularly good job. We're in a situation where, as referenced in your previous item, we've got sky-high energy prices. Obviously, there are other things feeding into it. But if you look at the rail regulator, for example, set up in 2004, annual budget of £30 million, 300 people employed, and it costs £389 for an open return from London to Doncaster. So regulation isn't always the answer, Darren. That's what I'm saying.
Is there a sense, at least anyway, aside from the kind of the granular detail of all of this, that the government's listening more to fans, if you like?
Yeah.
That for a long time there's been a real disconnect between kind of fans and owners, and the regulators, and now that's trying to reshift the balance again.
Boris Johnson realised during the first lockdown just how important football is in the national psyche, just how important it is. I mean, he was leveraging pressure on the Premier League to get games on, just so that people could sit at home and actually watch something instead of just sit around, doing cartwheels all day. There's that, but also a lot of people would be uncomfortable with the fact that Boris Johnson seems to be approving this, and yet he was the one who, according to reports before Christmas, actually intervened on the Saudi takeover of Newcastle to kind of smooth it through. So, and there he is proposing a regulator to prevent takeovers like that happening. So that's one of the instances, by the way, the Saudi takeover, where people are looking and wondering whether the Premier League is fit for purpose. I don't think the Premier League had the expertise to actually look into and delve into, from an office a few feet away from where we are now, and actually delve into the backstory of the Saudi owners who the Public Investment Fund. I mean, they've tried to kid us that it's not the Saudi state. Everyone can see it's the Saudi state. Yeah. So instances like that have brought this idea into focus. I'm just not convinced it needs another layer of bureaucracy to regulate. I don't think there's enough work for them to do. OK, Aidan, really appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. Aidan McGee there on the government's plans for changing the regulation of football. Now, we're going to end the programme with the board of Twitter, because it's agreed a $44 billion, just over nearly 35 billion quid, takeover of the company by Elon Musk. Elon Musk, who made the shock bid less than 2 weeks ago, said Twitter had tremendous potential that he would unlock. He's also called for a series of changes, from relaxing its content restrictions to eradicating fake accounts. However, Twitter employees have branded the new owner as dangerous, and some have threatened to leave the country. In fact, one told a newspaper he chucked up in the bin when he heard that it had gone through. Well, joining me now is the CEO and co-founder of AppMinds, Bill Ottman. Bill, good afternoon to you. Why has Elon Musk done this? What's he trying to get out of it? Surely it's not making money.
Thanks for having me. Look, I think we see that Elon wants global civil dialogue. The only way to have truly free and open dialogue is with a free speech policy. A lot of people are concerned about free speech these days. Look, no one likes hate speech. No one likes misinformation. But in fact, a lot of the peer-reviewed research around this topic proves that if you want to minimize hate speech, you actually need free speech in the long term. This is what allows society to vent their concerns and for dialogue to happen in a healthy way.
I get that, Bill, and we'll have to see how that plays out. But I saw someone tweet today, actually, saying that I think people always think kind of trying to regulate speech is relatively easy, and that if you kind of just make it a bit more of a free-for-all, well, it'll sort itself out. When we know, look at what the European Union has done. I mean, governments have made all this a lot more difficult. It's not an easy business trying to regulate speech.
No, it's absolutely not an easy business. In fact, it is a perpetually losing battle. And so I think that what we need to do is work on positive intervention mechanisms with users who are potentially problematic, but banning them, we know time and time again, causes increased radicalization, increased isolation, and polarization within society. You know, we have hundreds of years of good precedent that free speech, generally speaking, works. We like it. So, you know, I think that we should be happy that, you know, the Saudis didn't take over Twitter as opposed to, you know, an American entrepreneur. Elon certainly is a complex character and has his issues, but I think that in the long term, more transparency, open source algorithms, understanding what's really happening behind the scenes, this is really important for our major global communications platform to be transparent with the community about what these algorithms are doing.
In saying that, what do you think the reaction, or what do you make of the reaction of some Twitter employees? I mean, it does seem quite extraordinary that many of them seem unhappy about this, given that in many ways, of course, Elon Musk says he wants to improve the platform and to allow people to speak their minds more.
Yeah, I think there's a knee-jerk emotional reaction to, take personally harsh content that we see on the internet. But what we know is, again, this should be a data-driven decision. Does free speech create healthier dialogue, healthier discourse long term? And time again, in study after study, we see that this is the case. So yes, people should have full control over their content. They shouldn't have to see anything that they don't want to see. And but we need to think of problematic people on the internet more through the lens of mental health and compassion. Simply banning these people is not going to help the world long term. At Minds.com, this is the approach that we've been taking for years. We have a very healthy, thriving community, artists, musicians, political debates across the spectrum, capitalists, socialists. This is the kind of world we want to live in. We don't want to live in these polarized echo chambers.
And just very, very finally, do you think that Donald Trump, if you can say it in one word, will be back on Twitter?
Well, didn't he just come out and say that now he will not go back on Twitter?
Yeah, I don't know if he can resist the temptation.
Look, people are too fixated on these celebrity figures. We need to be focused on creating more healthy dialogue long term.
Okay, Bill, really appreciate that. Bill Ottman there joining us down the line from the United States. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon here on GB News. Well, there you go. That is it. I did want to bring you some of your views, but we have frankly run out of time. That is it from me for today. I'm back, of course, at 3 tomorrow. Gloria is here at 12. Tom Harwood at 9:30 with all the latest politics. Colin Brazier is up next between 4 and 6 with the drive time, the news. But that is it, as I say, from me for today. We'll leave you with the weather, and I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McKiven from the Met Office. Quite a bit of cloud out there at the moment, and much of that will thin and break overnight, allowing clear spells and, in places, a touch of frost by the morning. The reason being high pressure to the north of the UK, and around that high pressure, with the winds going in a clockwise fashion, we're pulling colder air in from the northeast. That's certainly having a notable impact on the east coast this afternoon, with temperatures at 9 to 12 Celsius and a bit of a chilly breeze. A lot of cloud across Scotland, northern and eastern England to begin things, but that tends to disappear overnight, and with lengthy clear spells, still some cloud floating around, but virtually everyone dry, and with those clear spells, temperatures will fall away. Mid to high single figures in most places.